All right, welcome back. So we're going to talk about different types of muscle fibers. So interesting. So we talked about motor units and fascicles and bundles. So bundles of these muscle fibers. And I think, I still do this all the time. I kind of visualize all these cells being identical, right? Why wouldn't you? If you take a dang it. If you take a look at this image right here. What you're seeing here, so each one of these different colored, shapes is going to be a muscle fiber or a muscle cell, right? And you can kind of see where there's a fascicle. There's a fascicle here, there's a fascicle here. And so you're noticing that they're slightly different colored. So they're stained specially in this case. And what you see is that each fascicle actually has kind of group of different muscle types, right? So we're going to talk about are these different muscle fiber types. So you have slow oxidative, oxidative glycolytic, or fast glycolytic fibers. Okay. So our slow oxidative are sometimes called slow twitch muscle fibers. It takes them a little bit longer to contract. These are very red in color, so you can see they're this dark color. Basically, they're dark red in color because they have lots of blood going to them. So that red blood causes them to be red in color. They will also have lots of myoglobin. As I mentioned to you in an earlier recording, this myoglobin is very similar to the hemoglobin found in blood. It is it's what oxygen is going to bind to. And it has lots of mitochondria. Okay, so mitochondria, the site of aerobic respiration. Aerobic respiration needs oxygen, so we have lots of myoglobin, and where you're going to get oxygen from the blood. So this kind of makes sense, right? So if we're going to have lots of mitochondria, myoglobin, blood vessels, these slow oxidative muscle cells are going to predominantly use aerobic respiration. If we're using aerobic respiration, that means we're using the activity that they're going to specialize in is prolonged sustained contractions. And an example of that would be to maintain posture. So those muscles that are their main function is to help you maintain your posture, so like the ones here in your back, they will have a large amount of these slow oxidative fibers. Okay. Let me kind of get rid of me so you can see the rest of the slide a little better. Fast oxidative glycolytic fibers. These are also red in color. However, kind of make note of this. They are red, but as you can see in this image, they are not nearly as a dark red. I mean, this is almost brown in the slow oxidative. So these fast oxidative glycolytic ones are kind of more of like a light red, it's like a dark pink, if you will. Okay. They will also have mitochondria, myoglobin, and blood vessels, however, not nearly to the extent that the slow oxidative ones had. So we want to make note of that. These split ATP at a very fast rate, faster than these slow oxidative ones. That's how they get their name. But because they also have a lot of oxygen going to them, they can also use aerobic respiration. So you're going to see these muscles in areas like in your legs, you're going to be used for walking, sprinting. Okay. And finally, the last type are the fast glycolytic ones, and you can see these are the ones in white. So they are white. So as you can imagine, if they were red, the earlier ones were red because you had lots of blood vessels. These are white because they don't have as many blood vessels going to them. They have lower amounts of these blood vessels. They have lower amounts of myoglobin. Because again, if you don't have a lot of blood vessels going to it, you're not going to be transporting as much oxygen, which means you don't need as much of the protein that binds to oxygen. And if you don't have a lot, you're not going to have as much mitochondria, because again, mitochondria are using oxygen in aerobic respiration to make ATP. So this means if you're not making ATP via aerobic respiration, you're doing it via anaerobic. And as we had talked about in previous lecture, that anaerobic is really good for short duration kinds of things. Things like weightlifting. Usually, when you're weightlifting, you're lifting a really heavy weight, fairly quickly. It's not prolonged like walking, sprinting, or maintaining your posture. So one of the things you'll also notice is that we'll just talk about elite athletes, like Olympic level athletes, because it's the easiest case to sort of talk about, or like NBA players or, you know, NFL players, those kinds of folks, the ones that really specialize in a sport and in an activity. If you do like a muscle biopsy, like you take a look at like a cross section of their muscles and you try to see like, well, do they have like an even split of these different muscle fiber types? The answer is no. So if you've got someone that's a huge weightlifter, they actually have quite a bit more of these fast glycolytic types, or those athletes that do really that burst kind of activity. Versus you look at someone who's like a marathon runner, and they have a lot more of these two muscle types. Okay? So it will vary in people, just naturally. So sometimes, you know, you only people that are just really, you know, they're kind of predisposed to a certain activity. That is not to say you can't get better at something, right? But sometimes these elite athletes, the ones that are like super good at something, you know, they do have a little bit of a physical edge to them. All right. So here are some thought questions for you that I'm not going to answer, but I want you guys to think about. And if you want, you can always email me, or you can talk to one another, or you can ask in lab. So think about this. Think about chickens. Think about what chickens do, right, and how they act. Why is chicken drumstick meat dark? It's dark meat. That's what we call dark meat. However, breast meat is white. Why is that? What did we just talk about with color and what the actions mean? Okay. Now this one you might have to look up a little bit, but I thought it'd be kind of interesting for you. Cows. We get our meat from cows. Steaks, burgers, right? Yummy, yummy ribs, all from cows. Meat. Okay. The building blocks of muscle are proteins, amino acids, right? So you can't make muscle from anything other than a protein. Okay. Cows, and even horses, they eat tons of grass. Now I'm going to tell you right now, there's not a ton of protein in grass. If there was, every weightlifter out there would be, you know, having giant lawns and eating grass nonstop. They don't. They drink protein powders and stuff, right? So how does an animal that is nothing but meat that we eat get all that meat if its diet is all grass? Where does it get the protein from to build all that muscle? Again, you may have to look this up. So go ahead and do that, and that's totally fine. But it's just something to think about, like how does this world work? Like how does all this stuff kind of work? All right, and let's look at this last one. You were born with basically all the skeletal muscle cells that you're ever going to have. Okay, this is true. You do not build more, at least not a significant amount, maybe a muscle cell here or there. So how does this guy, and maybe not him particularly because he injected himself with stuff, but if we're all born with the same amount of muscle cells, or even this individual is, how can he get his muscles, again, without artificial injections of some type? How do bodybuilders get so big? So think about it. We kind of discussed a little bit of this concept at the very beginning of the semester. All right, so let's just go over the other two types of muscle. We have cardiac and smooth muscle. And you'll get more into this in 202. So just again, really briefly, cardiac muscle is striated. These are short muscle fibers. You can kind of see they're branched, so it kind of splits in them. They generally have a centrally located nucleus. The cells are connected with something called an intercalated disc. It has gap junctions and what are known as desmosomes. If you remember back to that lecture with desmosomes that help anchor cells to one another. The gap junctions allow for communication between the cells. Right? We see that they're striped because they have that same thick and thin filament arrangement in the sarcomeres that skeletal muscles have. Now, cardiac muscle, when you get into 202, you'll talk more about how calcium is being delivered to a sarcoplasm. So it causes for a prolonged muscle contraction because in your cardiac muscle rather, what you're interested in is a pumping action. So you want to have a squeeze, release, squeeze, release, right? So you can get all that blood out. You don't want just like a muscle spasm because that's not going to help. That's not going to push the blood along. Again, these cells are autorhythmic, meaning that they can contract. Again, you can take the heart out of an individual and it will keep beating. If you put it in the correct solution, theoretically it should keep beating. Okay? So basically this is it means it's myogenic, means that the source of stimulus comes from the muscle itself. Heart rate, there's a range, so it's sort of like a mid-range kind of value. So range about 75 times a minute, needs lots and lots of oxygen. Cardiac muscle is unique in that the mitochondria are actually larger in it than in skeletal muscles. Again, we're using aerobic respiration. Last thing you want to do is have lactic acid buildup from anaerobic respiration. You don't need muscle cramps in your heart. That is bad, right? And again, there's extended contraction because of the extra calcium that's being delivered. There are basically two types of smooth muscle, and again, they're smooth because we don't have these stripes. We have what are known as visceral or single unit smooth muscles, and then we have what are known as multi-unit smooth muscles. Okay. And basically what we have, they're both really, the muscle cells themselves have the same setup. It's really more the way the neurons are connecting with them that makes a difference. So the visceral ones are in the walls of hollow viscera, so tubes, small blood vessels. Okay? These are autorhythmic. Again, they're not under conscious control. They will contract in unison to help move food along, like in your digestive tract, for example. Okay? Multi-unit ones, these are individual fibers. Each one has their own motor neuron. So you see these in arteries, the erector pili muscles, and in our skin, in the iris in your eye, so that's the colored portion of your eye, and in the ciliary body of the eye, that will help adjust and focus the lens of the eye. So you have these insanely tiny motor units, because again, you're having very specific actions occurring. Again, they get their name, they're smooth muscles, because we do not have a sarcomere setup. We still have the actin, we still have and myosin, so we still have these thick and thin filaments. However, if you look, they're anchoring to these little round things, and they're called dense bodies. Okay? So the myosin and actin are still going to move past one another, but now instead of pulling on Z discs and kind of lining up in that kind of neat, orderly row, and it kind of reminds me of like how a ham has that netting around it, right? And as you pull like the ends of that, or the corners of the diagonal, it'll squeeze the entire thing into a smaller unit. Okay. So basically, it'll pull on these dense bodies. These red lines are intermediate filaments. So you pull on a dense body, it pulls on the intermediate filament, and then basically that's going to cause the whole muscle cell to contract. Smooth muscle also does not have troponin. Because again, you got to regulate. You want to make sure that some of these muscles are contracting at some times and not at others. So there's no troponin. So to get that phosphate, so for this, it uses phosphorylation of myosin to bind to actin. So what that means is it uses something called calmodulin. So instead of troponin, it uses calmodulin. And calcium will bind to calmodulin. Okay, so calcium binds to calmodulin. So instead of binding to troponin, it binds to calmodulin. That calmodulin will activate what's known as a myosin kinase. Okay? So basically that calmodulin activates a myosin kinase. This myosin kinase will insert that phosphate to that myosin head. Do you remember like how, again, remember how that myosin head had to have that phosphate in order to attach to the actin? So instead of having ATPase and breaking down the ATP, and having that phosphate to ADP and phosphate, now this myosin kinase will simply put that phosphate on there. And that's what will cause it to attach. And then you can have contraction. Okay? So hopefully that makes sense to you. So just a few other things about muscles and how well they reproduce themselves. Okay, so your skeletal muscles, really after about you're a year old, they do not divide. You're pretty much, even before that, they're really stopping their division. So really at that point, you've got all the skeletal muscle cells you're ever going to have. You do have what are known as satellite cells. So if you damage a skeletal muscle fiber, these satellite cells will help repair it. However, if you damage it to the point where cells die, these satellite cells sometimes will turn into muscle cells, but not always. Most often, if you damage a muscle, you simply get scar tissue. And again, if the damage is just too great, fibrosis, that's scar tissue formation. So you have connective tissue fibers being laid down. So those collagen fibers, elastic fibers get laid down inside that muscle. And sometimes that causes pain because all these other muscle fibers are trying to contract, and now you've got sort of this bit of connective tissue running where it shouldn't, and so it inhibits or even impinges on those, and it can be kind of painful. There's also a case, it's kind of an interesting thing, you can watch a YouTube video on it. It's called fibrodysplasia ossificans progressiva, so that's what you see here. And what ends up happening, so under our normal everyday lives, in our everyday lives, we are constantly doing micro damage to our muscle cells, right? Small enough that the thing can repair itself. It doesn't kill off the cell. Actually, if anything, it stimulates it to grow. Okay? Or if you bang yourself, you cause a bruise, you might slightly have damaged the cells, but whatever, they can fix themselves, right? Well, in individuals with this fibrodysplasia ossificans progressiva, there's an inappropriate response. So instead of that muscle repairing itself, basically what you have are osteoblasts in that area, and basically it'll convert that muscle or that connective tissue to bone. So that's what you see here in this individual. All of that, what should have been muscle and tendons and ligaments, if they damage themselves even a tiny bit, it starts turning itself to bone. It's kind of crazy, right? So you can watch a video on that. It's kind of interesting. It's a fairly short video, but you kind of get an idea about that a little bit more. Right, cardio muscles. At one point, it was fairly well established in the literature that muscle fibers couldn't divide or regenerate. However, back in 2009, it became really clear that, yeah, about 1% of the heart muscle cells are replaced every year, and then, that rate kind of falls off. You can see the researchers that discovered that. So basically, about half the heart's muscle cells are replaced during a normal lifetime. And the way they figured this out, it's just really fast. So basically there's an isotope of carbon called carbon-14. We know how much carbon-14 there is in the atmosphere, and that's what you see here. So back when we did a lot of nuclear testing, we had particularly large amounts of carbon-14. And then gradually, as we've done more underground nuclear testing, the levels have fallen. But basically that carbon-14 gets incorporated into an individual's DNA. So basically you can tell when a certain cell was born by the levels of carbon-14 in the atmosphere. So if I take a look at your cell and I can see this level of carbon-14, I know that cell was produced at this time. Versus I look at another one and it has carbon-14 levels here, I know it was produced at this time. So that hopefully makes sense. Anyway, that's how they figured out that. So basically, if your heart cell never regenerated, all the cells in your heart should have had the exact same amount of carbon-14. When they actually looked at it in people, they saw that no, there were different levels, and some had more and some had less. So they could tell that basically the heart muscles were replaced throughout that individual's lifetime. Okay. And then this image right here, this is kind of neat. So this is actually the heart of a zebrafish, which is a fish. It doesn't particularly have zebra-like patterns, but whatever. And what you're seeing here, it has a simpler heart than we do. So here's the atrium, and then here's the ventricle. Okay. And in green are muscle cells from the atrium, and then in red are heart muscle cells from the ventricle. And what you see here is that there's actually green going on into the ventricle, which is weird. Atrium cells should be in the atrium, in that chamber of the heart, and ventricle cells should be in the ventricle, in that chamber of the heart. What these fish can do, and it's actually quite remarkable, if muscle cells in the ventricle are damaged, muscle cells from the atrium will migrate and repair the damage and basically take over the role of these ventricular cells that have died. Now, this has huge implications in research because in humans, if you have a heart attack and you damage those cells are damaged. Like your heart's just not going to function as well. You may even get scar tissue. So if we can figure out the mechanisms behind how, if a zebrafish's heart gets damaged, these cells kind of migrate and take over, so there's no detriment in function at all. If you can figure that out, that could potentially help a lot of people who've had heart attacks or have heart conditions. So anyway, I thought that was kind of cool. Smooth muscle fibers. Now these, regeneration is very prolific, right? Cells grow in size, so when they get bigger, it's called hypertrophy. In some areas, like in the uterus, there's quite a bit of smooth muscle growth that can occur. I think it's pretty obvious, like when uterus enlarges to hold the baby, right? So some of the cells divide, so you actually get more of them. That's called hyperplasia. And then new fibers can form from stem cells in blood vessel walls. So it's kind of neat. So you can even replace blood vessels, right? And you kind of know that. So atrophy basically is your muscles would shrink. So it can happen either you're not using it, use it or lose it, right? So if I don't work out, my muscles get smaller. Or if I damage the nerve going to the muscle will also shrink because it's not getting any signals. Okay? Once your muscle turns into connective tissue, becomes scar tissue, you cannot ever turn the scar tissue back into muscle tissue. So that's why it's really important to do whatever you can not to get it to turn to connective tissue. And then hypertrophy is simply the increase in muscle cells. So we know you have to do work. So you have to exercise, right? So that'll increase the number of myofibrils, sarcoplasmic reticula, the mitochondria. This just kind of gives you an answer to that earlier question as well. Okay. When you exercise, you actually cause small bits of muscle damage. Anything that's, I mean, obviously you can always pull a muscle and really damage it, but what we're talking about is small microscopic tears in the sarcolemma. So we're talking about damaged myofibrils, actin, myosin, disrupted Z discs, so at the sarcomere level, okay, super microscopic level. And basically your body is going to respond by increasing blood levels of myoglobin, creatine phosphate, creating more myofibrils. Okay, so your body responds to damage by building more. It's like, oh, we're doing this now. Okay, I better get bigger so we can prepare ourselves for this activity. Probably have all experienced at one point in our lives or another where you do whatever it is you do. You go to the gym, I don't know, go hiking, whatever it is. And then you're fine. After you might be tired, but you're fine, right? And then the next day, or the day after that, sometimes that's even more surprising, it's 48 hours later, all of a sudden you're sore. You're like, man, what the heck did I do, right? And we all know that you're stiff, things are tender, right? You might even feel kind of a little swollen. And that's because of that cell damage. You damage the cell, there's fluid leaking into that area. It's causing stiffness, tenderness, and pain. Right? It's impacting those nerve fibers and it's causing pain. All right? That's all I've got for you guys for this lecture on the muscle system. Next lecture, we'll be talking about the actual muscles in our body. We will not go into as much detail as we did with the skeleton. We're just going to talk about the general arrangement of muscles and the actual sort of physics behind muscle movement. Okay? Until next time, always feel free to email me or ask me questions in lab, and I will talk to you guys or see you guys later.